Saskatchewan Pete wiped sweat from his brow as he finally crossed the threshold into the ancient cave. He had been trying to get here for weeks, but he had constantly been harassed by members of the People's Party of Canada his whole way there. His aged father was bristling with excitement. "We finally made it, Michael!" "I told you, Dad. My name is Saskatchewan." "No, Saskatchewan was the dog's name." Saskatchewan Pete bristled and rolled his eyes, but examined the petroglyphs needed to open the final chamber. "Look, Dad. It's some kind of vessel holding a black liquid. There's 3 of them. A small one, a medium one, and a large one, I think. And here, a symbol of some sort of liquid produced from the milk of a cow. And another that looks like a white powder refined from beetroot somehow." "Of course!" his dad exclaimed. "Here, watch." His dad pressed down on the largest of the cups, then pressed both the milk symbol and sugar symbols twice. "Large double double. It all makes sense now." A grinding noise emitted from the wall as a door appeared. There, sitting on the pedestal, was a large tome, engraved with a circle containing a stylized maple leaf. But they were too late. "Ah, hello, Monsieur Saskatchewan. I have been looking forward to meeting you." "Damn it!" Saskatchewan Pete shouted. "Maxime Bernier! And look, your flunkies!" A dumpy, younger man with a gross beard and vacant expression stood next to the suave, blonde Quebecois man. "Is that Wexit founder Peter Downing?" On Bernier's other side stood a blonde woman with a plastic smile, wearing a Rebel Media t-shirt. "And neo-Nazi political reporter Faith Goldie." "Yes, and now that we have the Canuckonomicon in our hands, all the powers of Canada will be ours," Goldie shouted. "But if you..." Saskatchewan Pete started, but his aged dad grabbed him. "No, son, it's too late. They've won." Maxime Bernier let out a maniacal laugh as he turned to the ancient tome on the pedestal. "But Dad, they can't have that power." "Just trust me, son." Saskatchewan Pete wasn't so sure, but he relented. As Maxime opened the pages of the tome, he grinned. "Finally, ultimate power is ours." A bright light began to burst out, a howling wind tearing through the cave. At first, Maxime and his flunkies laughed, but those laughs quickly turned to screams as the flesh of the 3 white supremacists began to melt from their bones like candle wax. It was all over as quickly as it started. "My God, I knew it. This book wouldn't allow just anyone to wield its power," Pete's dad said. "Perhaps it's best the Canuckonomicon remains sealed away for now."
That sounds vaguely familiar.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Canuckonomicon. I'm your host, Benjamin Jr. Wandio, and I am here as ever with my dad, Todd Dirty Clyde Wandio.
Salutations.
So, last week we kind of left off on a bit of a cliffhanger, but before we get into it, I just want to remind everyone that if you like what you're hearing here today, you can find us on patreon.com/Canuckonomicon, where you can sign up. At $5 a month, you'll get access to exclusive episodes, which will start coming out soon. I promise. I've already got a topic picked out for our first Patreon exclusive. So that's $5 a month on patreon.com/Canuckonomicon. You can also find us on Ko-Fi if you want to give us some one-time gift at ko-fi.com/Canuckonomicon. And I will shout you out at the top of the episode. Speaking of which, I want to give a big shout out to our first Patreon backers, Northwestern Whispers. They're an awesome podcast if you're into kind of the spooky paranormal stuff. They do it with an awesome Canadian twist, and I think they've done a great job so far, so make sure you check them out. That's Nor_Western Whispers. So be sure to check them out wherever good podcasts are found. So, Dirty Clyde, how you doing?
Pretty darn chilly in the North Country today. Well, it's not as chilly as it was on, Sunday?
Yeah, no, it's finally getting a little snowy out there.
Even Bones wouldn't go outside.
Oh, good old Ratty Bones.
He was like, ain't doing it.
Yeah, my dog's been thrilled. Fats has been absolutely thrilled by all the snow out there. He's loved rolling in it. So
yeah, it's weird. I grew up in this country. I grew up, in Edmonton and lived there my whole life. I still hate winter. Always have. Can't stand it. Not even 10 minutes of it.
I don't mind this part of winter where it's not too cold out.
Yeah.
But once it gets to like that -30, that's when I start to not like it so much.
Tell me that next year when we're sitting in a deer blind, freezing our butts off.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
I just sent off for my restricted license.
Oh, good.
So should be getting that soon.
Oh, good. You found all your stuff.
Yeah, I found all my stuff. I found everything. Got everything sorted out and sent out. So
it sounds like a telephone conversation between the dad and his son.
Well, let's end that. So when we left off last time, good old Klondike Joe Boyle, the Irish Protestant man born rich in Eastern Canada, turned his hereditary wealth into the fabulous and ridiculous wealth of a large-scale gold miner in Western Canada, namely the Klondike. Then he tried to get his hockey team to win the Stanley Cup after marching them across a continent. They didn't, but it was a good time regardless. Now that's dope as hell, don't get me wrong. But that's hardly the only accomplishment that Joe Boyle would have. I hinted at it, but Joe is less Monopoly man and more of a James Bond type. And today, we're going to be taking a look at just how the rest of his life played out. Before I go ahead, I want to correct myself on something I got wrong in the last episode. While Joe Boyle was maintaining a pretty expensive lifestyle when he moved up to the Klondike, he had actually divorced his wife, Mildred Josephine Raynor, in 1897, only 9 years after marrying her. Her own lifestyle had become apparently a bit too extravagant and expensive for Joe, and the spark that was there just wasn't there anymore. Only after he divorced her did he actually end up making his trip to the Klondike round. So I missed that in the last episode. I wanted to correct it this time.
So he was there as a single man.
Yes, a single man. We left off after his Stanley Cup tour, which he didn't have a cup for. But Boyle wouldn't actually return to the Klondike for 4 years after the first time leaving. Questions were apparently being asked regarding concessionaires, which are people like Joe who owned large gold mining concessions in the Klondike and were supposed to be doing work on them. There were some questions as to the legitimacy of his operation and how he came by the concession, and he gets mixed up in this and as a result has to actually stay out east for 4 years to deal with this. His biographer, Leonard W. Taylor, explains all this really well in our main source, The Sourdough and the Queen. So if you want to learn more about like the specific business stuff that he got into, because Taylor spares nothing, he goes deep into the details, check that book out, but I'm not going to go into it here. I just don't find that very interesting, and I'm not very well versed in business law. In the end, though, Boyle escapes any actual convictions and is able to return to the Yukon in 1909. At this time, in the spring, he had actually married his second wife, Elma Louise Humphreys, whom Flora Boyle, Joe's daughter, was not particularly fond of. Maclean's magazine published this in an article written by Flora about her father. Elma was a nice, quiet little person who could have been happily wedded to a good, substantial business or professional man, with whom she could have led a normal life of peace and quiet. My father, a born fighter, always happiest in the middle of exciting, momentous happenings, never content with any humdrum existence, probably should have never married at all. So that's his own daughter saying that about him. So around this time, Joe was also expanding his business, and the headquarters for his company was growing from a camp into a small village just outside of Dawson, known as Bear Creek. But then something happened. See, a certain Archduke decided to visit Sarajevo, went down the wrong alley during a parade, and as a result got assassinated. Then Europe basically imploded on itself in what would become one of the worst wars in history. In August of 1914, Joe Boyle was secretly working with the government to raise funds and outfit a brigade specifically from the Yukon. This secret became public on the 2nd of September when Minister Dr. Thompson accepted Boyle's offer to outfit a unit. It would be one of 6 similarly privately funded Canadian brigades. Joe's son, on the other hand, Joe Jr., didn't join the war effort. Joe Jr. was, after all, an American citizen and didn't feel he had any place in the war. So keep in mind that Joe's first wife was American.
Right.
So Junior's refusal to join the war effort created a rift between him and his father that never healed because Junior never ends up joining the war effort. And it basically ended their relationship permanently. Joe Boyle also had a certain level of prescience about him regarding the dynamics of the next 2 wars. Machine guns had largely been dismissed early in the war as a weapon that no gentleman would ever use on another gentleman, despite evidence in colonial wars to the contrary. But Canadians were nothing if not innovators on the battlefield of World War I, and Joe Boyle, well, he was convinced that the sheer voluminous firepower of the machine gun would dominate future battlefields. And you know what?
He was right.
He was right. Yeah. While the British forces often consisted of 1,000 men marching with only 2 machine guns to them, Boyles Brigade, he envisioned, was going to be a 50-man force equipped with its own transport, 4 machine guns, as well as rifles and revolvers. So, in October, he got his brigade together and set them out on a steamer called the Lightning. They were singing a modified version of Tipperary as they headed to Vancouver for training. It's a long way to dear old Klondike. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to golden Yukon, to the homeland of the sourdough. You may sing of Tipperary, Strand, and Leicester Square. It's a long march to old Klondike, but my heart's right there.
Aww. he barely changed the words.
Yeah. I don't think he wrote it. I think this was his men who wrote it, but this is what they were singing as the Yukoners kind of loaded up and set out.
Right.
They ended up stuck in Vancouver for a while training, which really frustrated Boyle, who really believed in his men and really wanted them overseas in France fighting. They still hadn't been deployed by April of the next year and were starting to grow restless. A letter sent directly to Sam Hughes, however, fixed that, and in May they shipped off to Montreal, then boarded the SS Megantic on June 11th, arriving in Britain a week later. However, once in Britain, they ended up under British command, and much to Boyle's confusion, he had yet to be charged for machine guns. This went on for another 6 months, where they still hadn't been properly outfitted, still hadn't been sent out, and were still assigned to Shorecliff Camp in Kent, and having not seen any action. Felix Boutin, one of the soldiers, wrote to his brother in Dawson. In fact, a number of boys have transferred and gone to the front with other units. There are only 33 left, and most of us would give anything to get across to France, as we are ashamed to remain here. Not only that, but orders actually seemed to be that the Yukoners weren't even allowed to deploy without a transfer to another unit, as the idea was to try and keep them as a single unit. After a whole year of this, the Yukoners were finally equipped with 2 machine guns, In late February of 1916, they were moved from billets and into tents and began training as a machine gun unit and were attached to the 4th Canadian Division. Boyle was ultimately proven right about the usefulness of machine guns in warfare. Stubborn British lords couldn't shake their idea of warfare. The proud lines of riflemen firing in rapid succession, bunched together in tight units. And so the machine guns were making short work of them. And oftentimes these were Canadians who were being thrown onto the front lines and forced to march directly into machine gun fire or risk being charged with desertion. As we know now, this created the insane, sprawling battle trenches. The Germans were really the first innovators on this, creating German lines that were nearly impenetrable, lined with barbed wire, and using overlapping fields of machine gun fire. They were deeply dug in. The Allies eventually would copy this, and when I say eventually, it's not long after.
Well, they didn't really have a choice, did they? They were being shot at. So the guys were just digging in, and then the digging in became trenches.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the war, as we know now, became a terrible mess. So something that was supposed to last until Christmas, we're now 2 years into it at this point. On August 16th, 2 years after the breakout of the war, the Yukon machine gun battery finally made its way over to France. There, they served as a support and direct fire unit in Ypres. This is not the original Battle of the Bulge. This is the second one. And in October, they served with the 4th Canadian Division in the assault on Stauffenriegel in the Somme. This is towards the tail end of the Battle of the Somme, and they provided a curtain of lead to prevent a counterattack on the vicious creeping barrage, which was a tactic that had been invented by the Canadians and was now being perfected by them. Their rate of fire was apparently so intense that one of their soldiers actually ended up in the hospital because of the fumes being released from the gun as it ejected its rounds. So he wasn't gassed. It was just the smoke coming out of the gun that put him in the hospital.
Yeah, sure.
They were also part of a barrage on November 18th where they fired their machine guns starting at 10 a.m. They fired continuously, initially for 6 hours, and then for the next 26 hours provided cover fire. Their fire was, and I quote, practically continuous for a solid 24 hours in total.
That's insane that their weapons would even put up with that level of fire.
That was the benefit of these water-jacketed machine guns that the British favored.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the Germans and Italians were using air-cooled machine guns, which they had problems where you had to replace the barrel after a certain amount of use.
Right.
And couldn't maintain continuous fire for as long. But these big water-jacketed guns that the British were using, they were a lot heavier because you had to carry like jugs of water around. But as long as you could keep replenishing the water in the cooling jacket, the gun would be able to basically fire. They don't know how long. They were never able to actually get one of the guns to break under continuous fire.
Well, that's pretty cool. Well,
it's pretty neat.
Cool for a weapon that's meant to tear men in half, but
yeah. Yeah. So, in 1916, Joe Boyle himself arrived in London looking for an active service assignment. However, there was no role for a colonial with no military experience. But he did make friends with Herbert Hoover, who apparently offered his daughter Flora Boyle a job, though she never ended up getting it. While in England, he actually prevented the breaking up of a second unit of Yukon soldiers who had been raised by Captain George Black, and managed to convince the Brits to keep them together not just as a unit, but as a specialist machine gun unit. Because by this point, I think it was becoming abundantly clear that machine guns basically were dominating the battlefield of World War II. Mm-hmm. Boyle's fortune soon changed when the Americans entered the fray. One of the projects that was proposed by the American engineering unit was the assistance of the Russians in building and maintaining railways immediately behind their battle lines. So this was the ACE unit. I can't remember off the top of my head, and I thought I had it written down here, but I don't. But the ACE was basically an engineering unit that was sent over from America. They sent over intelligence, psych warfare agents, pure scientists, like computer scientists, as well as engineers. Engineers were the bulk of it. And so they had this idea of basically helping Russia solve its supply line issues as a way of keeping pressure on the Germans from the east. Joe Boyle was uniquely situated for this project. He had actually initially left Canada to visit Russia because he had heard kind of rumors that there was a possibility of foreigners being allowed to open gold mines in Siberia after the war. So he kind of wanted to be the first to have his feet on the ground over there. He also had experience in building and managing light railways from his time in the Yukon. Joining him on this mission was W. Poland, I.N. Dessau, and it was just W. Poland and I.N. Dessau. They had a huge benefit here in that Sir George Bury, the vice president of the Canadian Pacific Railway, had actually been to Russia a year earlier before the revolution, where he had actually been able to examine Russia's railway systems in Petrograd. He was actually witness to the Spring Revolution and the fall of the Romanov family. Canadian patriot that he was, Boyle ensured that this privately funded American mission hired a good number of Canadians to join him. So they set sail for Russia on June 20th, arrived June 25th, 1917 in Petrograd. Boyle quickly set to work, helping out where he could. However, he had been hustled out of London, and at the time, his mining company was under yet more litigation. They had won the first round, and now it looks like the competing company was going to appeal, but he was stuck in Russia, so there wasn't really a whole lot he could do from there, but he did what he could, sent over the power of attorney that his lawyers needed so that they could deal with it. He also noticed at this time that the War Office in Britain seemed to be really poorly informed at just how bad things were in Russia, especially for the soldiers who were fighting. Thus, he actually recommended the establishment of a foreign news agency to keep the Brits well informed on issues abroad in their allied states. He actually worked really closely with the Associated Press, who have been trying, in real life, to shake this idea that they were a propaganda piece for the Allies. Except if we look at Joe Boyle's account, that's exactly what they were.
Yeah.
He allowed them unprecedented access to officials during the war and was making sure that they were sending out useful, good information for people to know about in the Allied states. So he's only been in Russia for 12 days at this point, and he's already formulating plans to strengthen the railway-based supply lines for the Russians. He actually ended up doing a lot of really good work. He had taken command in Tarnopol when the Allies were being routed by the Germans. So Tarnopol was a little village that was basically being completely evacuated by the Allies, and there was a lot of people who were stuck in there. Mm-hmm. Boyle actually stayed behind even when the Russian commanders had fled, and he commanded a battalion known as the first Russian Women's Battalion of Death, or the Death Battalion, to cordon the town and restore order after the Russian commanders had fled. The first Russian Women's Battalion of Death was an all-women's battalion who had sworn to fight to the death to protect Russia. That's how they got their name. And just the sneak peek here, they are definitely going to be the subject of our first Patreon-only episode when I get around to writing it, which will be soon. Because holy crap, that is insane.
Well, you have an all-women's fighting battalion.
Yeah.
Nowhere else in the theater of war at the time was there a single woman holding a gun.
Not just that, Russia had 5 or 6 of them. All women's battalions.
That's pretty amazing. Pretty remarkable.
It is. So we're going to keep in mind that Joe Boyle is 49 at this time. This is part of why he wasn't able to get a commission. He's not a young man. He's got no battle experience before this event. But this event proved to the Russians, at any rate, that Joe Boyle was more than competent to lead a unit and to be a military man. On the 28th of July, Boyle's service with the ACE ended, and his service with the Russians began. He would be sent to the border of Romania. And here is really where our legendary story begins. Boyle continued to do a great deal of work supporting Russia and helping their supply lines throughout 1917. But, in December of 1917, truces had been established between Germany and both Russia and Romania. Boyle had stirred up some trouble with his kind of independent action in allowing himself to be assigned over to the Russians, and was actually being recalled by then Governor General of Canada, the Duke of Devonshire. However, Britain was having a lot of issues setting up diplomacy with the new Bolshevik government because they had not recognized the Bolsheviks as a government. So they were all trapped in Petrograd, all the British diplomats. Joe Boyle was not. He was, in fact, well respected by the Bolsheviks. As a result, the Romanian government actually used him to go to Petrograd on their behalf, in order to give Trotsky assurances that the Romanians were willing to play ball with the new Bolshevik government, provided they kind of laid off a little bit. Because Russia was kind of in a tense situation with Romania, particularly because the Romanians had their own set of communist revolutionaries who were trying to join Russia.
Right.
This suited Boyle well because, unbeknownst to his British superiors and unbeknownst to his Russian superiors, he was operating a spy ring. In 1917, he had apparently organized a network of units led by engineers who each selected to work beneath them 10 others, preferably officers and men of means, who would be willing to do whatever they were told at a moment's notice without asking questions about who or why was giving the orders.
Interesting.
They were to maintain secrecy, be loyal and obedient. There were to be no written reports or orders. All completely dark. And as soon as one of the officers noticed that one of the 10 men in his command was capable and independent and had enough initiative, he was to be raised up to lead his own troop of men. These units acted as saboteurs, which Boyle had raised up to sabotage the industrial units of the Russian Bolsheviks. He was now working as a double agent for Russia and Romania.
What a guy.
Yeah. So he returned to Romania from Petrograd in January. He had now 2 missions, one of which was to improve the rail transport system and to discuss Russian-Romanian relations with the current commander of the Southern Front, where the Bolsheviks were in conflict with the Romanians. All the while, the Governor-General was still trying to recall him back to Canada. His main goal was in trying to set up peace between Russia and Romania was mostly so that he could keep the Russians focused against the Germans. So, as a result, he went to Odessa in February, where he met with leaders of Russia and Romania, and was eventually able to create a peace treaty between the two. Rakovsky, the Russian leader, hated the Romanians and wanted nothing to do with this peace treaty. But this was Klondike Joe Boyle we're dealing with, and he managed to harangue him into signing it in a marathon negotiation session that went on until 5 in the morning. The treaty had 3 provisions. Romania would progressively withdraw troops from Bessarabia, except for troops protecting the rail lines. Next, if peace was negotiated with the Central Powers, so Austria and Germany, then the Russian forces in Romania would withdraw. Finally, safe entry would be granted for Romanian troops into Russia if they were forced to retreat from Romania due to the German advance. The treaty was presented before the Russian War Cabinet, who initially resisted wanting to deal with the German treaty. Or they initially resisted. They wanted to deal with their German treaty first. But they eventually signed the agreement, and it was ratified back in Odessa by the Rumcherad, which was the Soviet power structure that existed in southwestern Russia. It only existed for 1 year between May of 1917 and May of 1918.
This is when the Russians are pulling out of the First War.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, they're looking at getting out. Meanwhile, Joe Boyle is looking at keeping them in.
Most of their soldiers are fighting with dummy rifles.
Yeah.
They're basically bayonets. That's it.
And meanwhile, Joe Boyle is trying to fix their supply lines to make sure that they have proper weapons and trying to keep them in the war and off of Romania.
While at the same time spying on them.
At the same time spying on them, sabotaging their industrial network.
What an opportunist.
Oh, absolutely. So the Germans were now advancing on Jassy, the temporary capital of Romania, and it looked as if it was going to be captured by the Central Forces. The Allies were jumping ship, and Romania was terrified that it was going to be abandoned and left on its own. It was in these conditions that Joe Boyle met Queen Marie of Romania. It was March 2nd, and Queen Marie writes, "Although full of anguish, I had a busy day and made the acquaintance of a very interesting Canadian, a certain Colonel Boyle, who is working for us in Russia, trying to better our situation and especially our transport. A curiously fascinating man who is afraid of nothing and who, by his extraordinary force of will and fearlessness, manages to get through everywhere. A real Jack London type."
Which is exactly what he was aiming for.
He is a Jack London character.
He really is.
Yeah. So, for those who don't know, Jack London is the guy who wrote White Fang and Call of the Wild, which are both set in the Klondike Gold Rush. And so he is literally a character lifted out of a Jack London novel.
Yeah, really.
So this is where his story, I think, is quite interesting. So they met 3 more times that week. She even stayed up late as the various Allied diplomats left during a storm. Apparently, Boyle arrived in the reception hall soaking wet from the storm that was raging outside at the time. Allegedly, there was an exchange that went like this. "Have you come to see me?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Joel replied. "I have come to help you, and my God, woman, do you need help?"
Oh.
I love this guy.
Yeah.
Evidently, they talked for hours afterwards. She wrote of this meeting later. "We understood each other from the first moment we clasped hands, as though we had never been strangers." Boyle was a rambling man, and he was still technically married to Elma Louise. His current wife was living in Dawson. He had left her there years ago, and he would never see her again. But here he was, flirting with the granddaughter of Queen Vicki herself.
Oh, yes.
After this meeting, he went back to Odessa with orders from the Queen to make sure that the 70 Romanian hostages, so it's 70 Romanian hostages, that had been arrested by the Russians, were safely returned in exchange for, I think it was approximately 400 Russian prisoners that the Romanians had. This prisoner exchange went horribly wrong. The Romanian Revolutionary Battalion, which was a Soviet group, was in charge of the Romanian hostages. Even though Boyle had instructions from the Rumcherad to return the prisoners over into his custody, the leader of the revolutionaries wasn't able to get his men to actually release the Romanian hostages. In the confusion that ensued afterwards, 2 hostages were killed and 7 more disappeared. Boyle eventually managed to get out with the hostages, but got caught in a storm and wound up not in Romania, but on the Crimean island of Theodosia, where the Bolsheviks were still fighting the White Russians. From there, he and the prisoners were recaptured by the Bolsheviks. He was able to bribe a Bolshevik officer to help him and the prisoners escape, and they made their way for Sebastopol. From there, he was able to contact a German general for safe passage to Salina, but unfortunately that general didn't tell the Austrians, who currently held the port of Salina, which delayed them for an additional 3 days. Eventually, they were able to get up the Danube to a railhead, where, after some bickering and an angry letter, all of the hostages were able to get on board and return home to Jassy. For his efforts, he was awarded the Romanian Star of Freedom and celebrated in the newspapers as the Savior of Romania. As a result of this, Britain finally rescinded the Governor General's recall order for Boyle. That's what it took. Yeah. It took him saving a bunch of hostages and getting an award before Britain was like, okay, well, maybe he can stay.
Yeah.
So Romania wasn't faring well in the war. Bessarabia was being invaded, and the port of Odessa had been captured by the German forces. They had also rigged an election in Romania, installing a pro-German government. Queen Marie, as a result, withdrew to Cotofanishti, which is where her cottage was, in order to get away from the Germans and their government. Joe Boyle joined her there for a little while, as the puppet government obviously wanted nothing to do with him, and so he spent his time riding horses with the Queen. He continued operating his spy ring, and would meet with former Romanian government officials in order to make plans. The Germans didn't really seem to care that he was there, and so they let him keep moving about, making him appear at times in German-owned Bessarabia, so he's doing okay.
So he almost had a free reign over Europe.
Yeah, he could just move around, and nobody seemed to really pay much attention to him. Unfortunately, this is where things start to get a little bad for him. While attending intelligence meetings in Kishinev, Boyle had a stroke in his hotel room shortly after arriving. He was in very bad condition for the first 2 weeks and couldn't be moved. And only once he was healthy enough to be moved, he was then sent to Queen Marie's summer palace on August 1st of 1918. There he became friends with Queen Marie's daughter, Princess Ileana, and slowly recovered. Leonard Taylor wrote that Marie had breakfast with him every morning, after which they and her kids would go for a drive and have picnics together. This is the life of Klondike Joe Boyle.
I know.
Once recovered, Boyle began helping the Red Cross recover medical supplies that the Romanians had confiscated, diverting some of them to the White Russians in Crimea, and using others to help Queen Marie start a medical organization, the Order of Maria Regina. He helped Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna to escape to Romania from Odessa, and attempted to help the Dowager Queen Maria Feodorovna escape Crimea to Romania, but she refused. She chose to stay in Crimea. Joe Boyle, starting in 1922, began to suffer slowly progressing heart and kidney failure. Leonard Taylor wrote of his death on the 14th of April in 1923. Sometime on the 13th of April, Joe Boyle wrote 2 letters and placed them under his pillow. Nurse Wilkie, tenderly caring for him, noted he had had a peaceful night, but had not slept. Saturday morning, on the 14th of April, dawned bright, clear, and warm, the sort of day that poets write about. About 10 a.m., Joe Boyle asked his nurse to draw back the curtains. She turned to do so, as he spoke of getting up. When she looked back, she realized he was dead. Queen Marie was devastated by his death. She wrote a 12-page letter to a friend of hers, lauding him, and in it was this passage. There was a special understanding between us, something deep, real, strong, I may say holy, based upon a perfect belief, faith, and respect. There was something straight in us both, straight and simple and uncritical, which made it seem that fate had meant us to come together. He was all strength and honor, and he had given me his faith, and I had given him my trust. We clasped hands at the hour of deepest distress and humiliation, and nothing could part us in understanding. No one knew his heart better than I. Women played but little part in his life, and he had a wealth of love unspent. I came to him at the end of a long, stormy road. I was in distress. He recognized at the same time some of his own spirit in me. I was something of a miracle in his life, and when he had his stroke, I was the haven in which he anchored for a while. For me, he is not dead. He was so big, he belonged absolutely to nature. For me, he is in the trees, in the sky, in the sea, in the sun, and in the wind that sweeps round my house. He is in the freshness of the early morning and the silence of the night, and the stars seem to watch me with his eyes, and the clouds seem to bring me messages from that great heart that was mine. Legends say that every year from 1923, on the anniversary of his death, a mysterious woman in dark clothing visited his grave and placed flowers on it. The woman stopped appearing in 1938, the same year that Queen Marie died. Joe Boyle had been honored by the French, Russians, Romanians, and even the British. But of all the medals on his chest, none were from his home country of Canada. He never received official recognition for the work he did in raising the Yukon forces that did so much for the war effort. His remains stayed in Europe until 1983, when he was finally reinterred back home in Canada with full military honors. And thus ends the story of Klondike Joe Boyle.
Wow.
That's a crazy one, eh?
That is a crazy one. Holy cow.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing how in that time, because you didn't need passports and documents and visas, and you could travel far and wide rather effortlessly, even in wartime.
Well, almost especially in wartime, because everybody's so focused on other stuff that's going on.
Yeah, but you would think, okay, here's a obviously Canadian citizen, but at that time would have been considered, sort of British in a way. And he just has free reign to travel here, there, and everywhere, because he seems harmless to people, but he's actually, involved in all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. Hugely connected individual.
I am disappointed, however, that there is no encounter of him fighting a bear.
Shocking. Truly. Although, if we remember from last time, he did knife fight a shark.
Yes. I guess that's a good replacement. if he can't go hand to hand with a bear, at least you can have a knife fight with a shark.
Yeah. His story is truly wild. He doesn't sound like a real person.
No.
Like you read everything about him, he's done so much, and I talked about the high points.
Mm-hmm.
But if you read Leonard Taylor's biography, The Sourdough and the Queen, there's so much in there. I had to kind of pick and choose what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
Leonard Taylor goes into a lot more detail on specific military operations he was involved in. A lot of detail on his businesses, tons of detail on his businesses, and even stuff on how his estate was handled after he died and kind of what his kids ended up doing. Flora Boyle wrote a 3-part memoir for him in Maclean's magazine, where I got pretty much any time I'm talking about stuff Flora said, that's where that comes from.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of considered one of the big sources next to Leonard Taylor's book. Pierre Burton mentions him in a book on people from the Klondike. The stuff on the military operations for this one I pulled from a book called From the Klondike to Berlin, which was a detail of the Yukon military units that served in World War One.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. It's a pretty intense story.
And so wide-ranging. Like,
yeah. It's perfect fodder for a biopic. So if somebody's out there and got money and wants to make a Canadian film that's actually like interesting and good, maybe make one on good old Joe Boyle here, because he's a figure.
Yeah, really seems to be one.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I know it was mostly me talking, but I mean, that's what you get in most episodes, to be honest.
I usually put in the odd gruff statement, but I didn't really have anything today.
There wasn't really much to add today. Usually when we talk about weird stuff is when you get a lot more to talk about.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Be sure you can follow me on Twitter at Canuckonomicon. You can email us, canuckonomicon@gmail.com. If you're interested, get in touch, and I'll probably reply. I don't get a lot of fan mail, so you'll almost certainly get a reply from me if you want to hit me up. As a bonus today, I'm going to read our first YouTube comment, which reads, let me just look it up here. A man named Dirty Clyde is someone I want to meet.
Yeah, I didn't invent the name. I wasn't the original Dirty Clyde. The original.
Well, that's our.
In the cartoon that we were drawing, Dirty Clyde was a friend of mine who's a marine biologist in the States, and I was the author friend.
Oh, there you go. So yeah, be sure to hit us up. Let us know what you think, and we will see you next week.
Take care, everyone.
Keep your eyes on the sky.
Canuckonomicon is a production of Crossing Clay Studios. We can be found on Twitter at Canuckonomicon, and you can contact us through email at canuckonomicon@gmail.com. Please be sure to share us with your friends and family, and keep your eyes open.